I am joined today by Dr. Oren Tepper. Dr. Tepper is on the faculty at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and is the director of the craniofacial program at Montefiore Medical Center. Dr. Tepper, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Now, your initial research career was in basic science, but it seems like you've moved a lot more towards the technological aspects that we can bring into the operating room. I think this was nowhere more present than in your work on the separation of the conjoined twins, Aeneas and Jaden McDonald, in October of 2016. Can you tell us about that case and how technology played a role in reconstructing the skulls of these twins who are conjoined?
Yeah, sure. For me it was interesting because I have been involved in this technology and 3D research for quite some time, almost 10 years. It sort of paralleled not only my clinical interest, but the timing of all of this as the technology got better and better. It just became more applicable for what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So the separation of Aeneas and Jaden was really kind of the culmination of all of that research and planning that I've been doing really for the last decade that made a case like this possible. But for those twins in particular, we really did a number of things that we brought in a number of different aspects of technology that were critical for this. The first was the ability to just plan out the procedure on the computer first. That's a concept called VSP, or virtual surgical planning. And we've been doing that for some time in reconstructive surgery. But this was really the first time that something like this has ever been applied for a set of conjoined twins. And then the other is 3D printing. And what 3D printing allowed us is to really have anatomical models that we could use, that we could study, and we could really plan out the different portions of the procedure. And then in terms of the virtual plan, it's great to have an ideal situation on the computer or plan out the procedure, but the key is making that happen in the operating room. And so what 3D printing allows is to begin to plan out that procedure and then print guides and different references that you can use in the operating room to actually execute what you had planned out first on the computer.
So that's something I certainly wanted to touch on, because I think when we think 3D printing, we think printing pieces of a skull or something like that, printing a structure that you're going to leave inside the patient potentially. But with these guides, it's something different. Can you go into a little bit more detail? These are actually helping you get to the position you need to get to?
Yeah, and your point about guides, or rather printing parts that are missing, that's where this is all heading. And I have no doubt that in the coming years, that essentially being able to bioprint or print materials that are compatible with the human body is going to be available to us. But in this case, what was unique, and I think what's more kind of happening today on a day-to-day basis, is not printing parts, but printing guides. And so what I mean is this all began with, let's say, the skull. These patients' normal, or their normal anatomy, their baseline anatomy. And then we were able to print the representations of their brain and the critical vessels, etc. So we have a baseline print. But on the computer, we could then plan out how we're going to separate the boys, what type of reconstruction we need, and to make that happen in the operating room, now we're talking about printing guides that can be sterilized and are essentially part of the operating room table, part of our instruments that we're using in the OR. That's another thing that we bring into the operating room to begin to tell us where do we cut, where does a reconstruction begin, what would be an ideal reconstruction, what would be safe procedures, things like that. And what we found in some research that we're doing in other cases, and I think just anecdotally was the situation for these boys, is these things not only help us be more precise, but I think it really cuts down on operative time because there's less variability.
Sounds like less guesswork.
Absolutely.
So when you say you're planning these operations beforehand, walk us through that. You've got, I presume, a 3D model of the anatomy, of this case of these two children, and you can, in the computer model, you can make incisions, you can tie vessels. How long does that process take? Yeah,
it can be anywhere from something very simplistic to something very extensive. In this case, it was pretty complex, but it's an interesting kind of collision of different specialties. And for a typical virtual planning session, in the case of these boys, what we had was the neurosurgeon, Dr. James Goodrich. We had myself. We had a radiologist, Jack Farinas, who really kind of helped us understand the images and some of the intricacies of the anatomy. And then we have medical engineers. In this case, it was using 3D systems. But imagine all four of those specialties on a virtual web meeting, beginning to say, well, this is what I'd like to do surgically. And then we have the radiologist saying, well, can that be done anatomically? And then we have the engineer saying, well, let me print you something that can represent that or help you achieve that. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of all this technology, because that hasn't really been done to this level. And I think that's the future of this. It's not just going to simply be surgeons. It's not going to be radiologists. It's not going to be industry. I think it's this kind of mix, this interdisciplinary approach to 3D printing that ultimately is going to be make it really routine.
So you'd practiced in silico, essentially, before you actually got into the operating room. Take us into the operating room. When you were actually operating, did you have a sense of familiarity? Did you say, oh, I know where I am? I've seen this anatomy a million times on the computer screen? Or were you still having that feeling of exploring a sort of uncharted territory?
With surgery, there's always uncharted territory, so to make you think that we knew exactly what we were going to enter, etc., would be not untrue. But certainly there was familiarity, and I'll give you an example. We had a print, or I had a print available to me of just the external surface of these boys. So I could spend hours planning out where my incisions were going to be, where my cuts need to be made, the type of reconstruction that would be ultimately be required. Imagine trying to turn these boys in the office. It was very difficult to actually take them, maneuver them, examine them like we would any other patient. So here we are with a very intricate, exact match of these boys' anatomy, their size, that I could plan that out. With the virtual plan, we had actual guides that we would put on the boys to tell us where to cut and how the reconstruction should go. So that's exactly what was happening. When I first made the incision and we prepared everything, we took these guides and they fit exactly where we needed them to be. And at that point, Dr. Goodrich and I said, well, this is where we're going to enter, this is where we need to be. And then we had a model of what's beneath that to tell us what we'd be approaching, what would be our next step. So it really helped tremendously throughout the whole case.
Do you think this type of surgery would even be possible without this technology?
It has been done before. So to say this is the first time that conjoined twins have been separated, there have been a few dozen cases historically. This is the first, to our knowledge, where this technology was made possible, and I have no doubt it certainly helped the success. Ultimately, I think there are some really key points where we weren't sure if this could be done, and I really believe the technology got us to that level of saying we think we can do this safely and successfully.
And I'll let our viewers know that it was a very long operation, but the kids came through successfully as we're talking about this. That's correct, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. You spend a lot of time working with this technology, so if you don't mind, cast us forward 10 years. What does the operating room of the future look like to you?
Well, I'll tell you, for me, as a reconstructive surgeon and an aesthetic surgeon, 3D printing is now starting to really be routine for a lot of surgeons. The idea that we can have models versus just traditional images, but real physical models that we can hold and turn, I don't think we're a far way off from seeing that really in every operating room. And that's kind of the planning session. I think the next phase is going to be what I talked about, is that interaction that between us, a biomedical engineer, a radiologist. At the moment, the way we all know medicine is practiced is radiologist reads the films, the surgeon, let's say, looks it over, goes to the operating room. There's not much back and forth. But I don't think we're very far from a situation where there's going to be real-time back and forth communication. The surgeon, the radiologist, other specialists, where they're a part of that operating room rather than just preliminarily reading films or giving their assessments. I think fast forward 10, 15 years, what we're seeing now in physical models is going to be digital. What I mean by that is it's going to be a hologram. And we have some research and we've seen some interesting technology that will take, for example, in this case, rather than have 3D prints, imagine that was projected in space. And you can call upon that data. It's infinite, the amount of data you can pull in that regard. So I think probably 15, 20 years, we're going to see a lot more digital integration in the sense of virtual files in the operating room. But for now, I think physical models are going to be where we're at.
Well, this is absolutely a fascinating area, and it's very heartening for all of us that you're obviously putting it to such good use. Congratulations on this operation and on the others in the future, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.